The Dandelion Dynasty as a whole is hard to recommend. I'm sure there are lots of people out there who I could recommend The Grace of Kings to. A sweeping epic fantasy that is almost more like Fire and Blood than it is like most narratives. I can probably recommend The Wall of Storms to most fantasy fans. It is more of a classic fantasy narrative with a deeper focus on the characters, insane world building, political scheming, and absolutely epic battles. The problem is that a lot of the people, even though I think most people would like Wall of Storms, I'm not sure many of them would like Grace of Kings, and there's probably a smaller subset of people who I think would really like Grace of Kings and then not like Wall of Storms enough. And then you get to Veiled Throne and Speaking Bones, that Ken Liu sees as one book, despite the fact that they're both like 1,000 pages. And once again, I think the target audience switches. But in this video, I'm going to talk about why I kind of think of these as 3 parts, and why I love all 3 parts. Why I think for a lot of you, the Dandelion Dynasty is worth trying, and why it's probably one of the 5 best fantasy series I've ever read. Hello everyone, it is time for a series review for the one I recently wrapped up, which is the Dandelion Dynasty by Ken Liu, which, as I just said, is probably one of my 5 favorite series of all time. And I already have a Grace of Kings review, just for an individual book 1, which does actually very much work as a standalone. This is a tricky series to review, because if I was reviewing just books 2, 3, and 4... like, that review would sound very, very different to my review of Grace of Kings. They're very different novels, which is why it can be kind of hard to recommend. And it's not the case of, like, book 1 is bad and then it gets much better. Book 1 is my least favorite of the 4, but that's just because I prefer the styles of the other ones. It's not like, you know, there's some other series where, Dresden, where someone's like, yeah, book 1 is my favorite Dresden novel. I'm going to be like, it is? Why? If someone's like, yeah, Grace of Kings is my favorite Dandelion novel, I'll be like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. It does a bunch of stuff the other novels don't. And it's extremely well plotted. It's zoomed out from the characters, but I still think the character work is very good. He's very good at getting us, like, attached to characters very efficiently. And the world building is exceptional, and, you know, it's got a lot of really good stuff in it. And then there's the next 3 books, which are definitely, like, more similar to each other than they are to Grace of Kings, but are all each distinct. And, like, if I know someone who I'm very confident will like Wall of Storms, Veiled Throne, and Speaking Bones, it's kind of hard to be like, yeah, there's this 600-page epic fantasy that you might hate, you might like, you might hate, I don't know. You should read that to get to this book that you really like. So it's kind of hard to recommend to someone like that. And then vice versa, if I have someone who I think will really like Grace of Kings, but then I'm like, I don't know if they'll like Wall of Storms. This seems like the less likely option. I think more people will be the other way. And I guess you could read Grace of Kings as a standalone, but it's kind of weird. So basically, the thing about Grace of Kings is it's not really what the series is about. It's basically a massive 600 and something tall paperback, 618 page prologue. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I think it's a very good prologue. It's comparable to, if you think of all the series that have, like, multiple sub-series, like the First Law. There's the First Law trilogy, and then the standalones, and then Age of Madness. This, I think, R. Scott Baker series has, like, 2 parts. Red Rising has 2 parts. You know, a bunch of series like this. This is just, like, an entire series condensed into one novel, and this is, like, the base for the story of what the actual story is about. This is just a bunch of stuff that is compelling on its own, but also just enriches the story of the other things, and has a lot of, like, you know, important information. Like, stylistically, I've said it's kind of, like, halfway in between Fire, Blood, and, like, a classic epic fantasy. Which, you know, I think could appeal to a lot of people. And I stand by the review. But I think for most of this review, I want to talk about books 2, 3, and 4. Because if you want to know more about book 1, you can go watch my review for book 1. So, book 2 is easily the one that I think will have the most mass appeal. Like book 1, I think it's one of the best paced large books I've ever read. It looks really intimidating. It's like 850 pages with, reasonably small font. I don't know how many words it is, but it's a lot of words. But I have to say, this book flew by. I don't know how many days I read it in, but usually, like, with most books, I'm a solid, like, when I'm not in a slump. I'm actually in a bit of a slump right now. But usually I'm, like, a solid 100 pages a day. This, I hit, like, 200 or 300 on multiple days. It one more chaptered the crap out of me. It's very, it does, like, have flashbacks. It's not a straightforward linear narrative where, like, you'll be following one thread and then you'll run into something and then it'll, like, go back and show, like, how that got there. And it has stories within stories. And it's plotted and paced just exceptionally well. It's also, I think, has a phenomenal mix of, like, introspective, well-written, complex, character-driven stuff, really cool, like, thematic stuff, and also just, like, sheer epicness and sheer insanity. It is, I think, for epic fantasy fans, people are okay with, massive secondary worlds and, these big casts of characters and huge books. It's one that, if this were a standalone, I'd recommend it to most epic fantasy fans. And I think if you tend to like books I like, the chances of you not like, I think you'll really like Wall of Storms. I think it exceeds in almost every aspect. I think the character work is superb. I think it's clearly superior to book 1. I think the writing is just excellent. Like, it's so smooth and evocative. It would definitely be in the upper echelons of prose. I like the prose in Grace of Kings. I think the prose gets better in each of the 4 novels and already starts really good. The world building is one of the most fascinating, like, in-depth worlds that I've encountered. And there's no parts of this book where I'm like, oh yeah, that's a pacing problem. Like, people are going to get stuck on that. Like, the entire book from start to finish was, like, just continually compelling. And so I think, almost all of you, I should be like, yeah, Wall of Storms. And then we get to books 3 and 4, which I feel also have less appeal than Grace of Kings, but for different reasons. I think these are not page turners to the same extent that the first 2 are. Even Grace of Kings, like, Grace of Kings one more chaptered me multiple times as well, got me staying up late into the night. Veiled Throne, even though I like it more than Grace of Kings, because I think the character work is superior, it really starts to focus on someone who is straight up one of my favorite fictional characters, like, ever. Now, if I do a ranking, like an updated favorite character ranking, they're gonna be high on that character ranking. It also has some parts where, I could see someone reading it and being like, hey, why are we doing this? There's a cooking competition. And it's not like a cooking competition where, like, if they lose, the world ends. It's a cooking competition where if they lose the cooking competition. Which, some people bounce off of. And I get it. It's not a huge part of the novel, but, like, there's quite a bit of cooking competition. It's not like it's the entire second half of the novel, but I think it starts pretty far into the novel, and it's, one of the main plot lines that's going on. There's also, like, 2 plot lines in the last 2 books that seem very separate. So if you care more about one of them than the other, I could see you being frustrated with going over to the other plot line. I was fortunate in that I loved both plot lines. But, like, I get it if Veiled Throne is not your thing. Same with Speaking Bones to a lesser degree. I think Speaking Bones is one of the most ridiculously fantastic novels I've ever read. I think it would be hard not to be satisfied with the ending. I think the ending is, like, pretty uncontroversially phenomenal. But I could see some people being the journey kind of being like, okay, we're doing this now. We're introducing this plot line now. These 2 plot lines are still split up. What is going on? That being said, I think the final book, Speaking Bones, also not as much of a page turner. It's still, like, it was not like I was ever bored. I would like to now make the distinction between being bored and not being a page turner. I can be reading something and be really enjoying it, but then get to an end of the chapter and not have like the immediate urge to find out what happens next. And then there are books where I can't stop. I have to keep going. And that's obviously a good sign for a book, but it's not like that means I automatically like a book more, because if I'm enjoying it more while I'm reading it, even if I then, can finish a chapter and be like, okay, I'm satisfied with that chapter for now. It's not necessarily a negative sign, which was the case for Speaking Bones, and this, after Grace of Kings, I would not have thought that the thing that I liked most about the series is probably the character work, including, again, my favorite character in this series might be, top 3 favorite fictional character. They are one of the most ridiculously well-done characters I've ever encountered. They are unlike anyone else I've ever read. They're, everyone seems to have a different opinion of them. You can make a strong case for or against them morally. They're incredibly psychologically complex. Their depth is amazing. Anyway, and this has a lot like that going. The entire cast of characters, in terms of, I talk all the time about how deep a series bullpen of characters is. I think Speaking Bone, meaning a deep bullpen, means even the 50th, the character with the 50th most page time is still really well fleshed out. I think Speaking Bones, and Veiled Throne, but Speaking Bones especially, has one of the deepest bullpens of really well done characters of any series that I've read. It's ridiculous. You'll get to people who it's yeah, I haven't seen this person for 3 books. Holy crap, I love this person. Where have they been in my life? Yeah. So on that aspect, it's phenomenal. Also, one aspect that for some people could be a selling point, and for some people could be a negative, is there is a lot of engineering in this novel. This is if wars were fought by engineers. So there will be problem solving to get out of there. And there's a lot of building things with silk and bamboo. He refers to the series as silk punk. And he has a really good explanation on why he likes that term. If I remember, I'll link it in the description. If not, remind me in one of the comments and I'll post a comment. And I think, some kind, obviously not as futuristic, but a Project Hail Mary type problem solving and engineering type thing. I've seen it compared to Rhythm of War. I think it's pretty different from Rhythm of War, with the disclaimer that I really liked Rhythm of War. I think Rhythm of War is a lot about a way the magic works fictionally. I also think there's some really good character work in that for Rhythm of War, but that's a topic for another time. But for the actual science part, it's a lot of figuring out how this fictional magic system works. Well, this, a lot of the, they're not magic based. It's more about just problem solving with technology. And I found them really interesting. I'm sure some people could read it and not find it interesting. Just I found the structure of the final book. There's a battle where they'll be it'll cut back and forth. It'll be battle, and then it'll cut, it'll start of the battle and then cut to preparation, and then go back to the battle and then cut to preparation. I thought it worked extremely well. One thing I would also say about this series that I think most people now consider a positive is how not safe the characters are. This is plot armor is quite weak in this series, and I think Ken Liu is one of the people who not only is brutal, doesn't have plot armor, but is extremely good at getting you to care about characters very quickly. He's very, very efficient at characterization, giving you the idea of who someone is in a very short amount of words. But I will, yeah, so the technology, I know I'm backtracking, but the technology aspect, that's more of a focus in book 3 and 4. So for example, there's a Discord user named Nick, who I think most of the time when I'm recommending this series to people, it's the opposite. I'm I hope they enjoy the technology stuff, but I'm pretty sure they'll enjoy all the other stuff. Nick, I'm I don't know if he'll enjoy all the other stuff, but he'll enjoy the technology stuff. He'll find that really cool. Or you can be me and find all of it really cool. But so I think you can see why I find this series so hard to recommend, because you have to like so many different things. If you tend to have very specific tastes, the chances that you'll like the series are probably very low. Because while the thing you like is probably in there somewhere, most of the series is probably not the thing you like. But I think if you have pretty broad tastes, and if you look at your top 10 fantasy list, and they're a bunch of really different stuff, I think the chances of you liking Dandelion are really, really high. Because, one, you probably like the variety, and two, just from a quality perspective, it's fantastically good. Just from a quality, it's so well-rounded. If you look at, like, each aspect, like, the prose is exceptional. I talked about the character work. The exploration of theme, I think, is some of the best in the genre. It's got one of the deepest bullpens of characters. It's, like, got character work going both in, like, how many characters, how strong emotions I feel towards those characters, and at the top end, it has some of my favorite characters ever, including my favorite character in the series, who's pretty separate from everyone else. The world is insane. I think I said in my Goodreads review that I'm not saying I think it's the best world in fantasy, but I think in terms of creativity, depth, and how it's delivered, I think it can stand up to basically any fantasy series. Like, in the same, tier. Like, I'm not going to put it ahead of Middle-earth. Okay, it's hard to put things in the same tier as Middle-earth. You know what I mean. It's very well-rounded. It's also got some of the most badass action sequences. It's got a lot more battles than fights. That's something I kind of noticed, which I like to say I consider a battle a clash between two armies, and fights a clash between, like, small groups of people. This has very few, like, small scale action scenes, kind of like, like Dresden would be the opposite. Dresden has, like, a huge amount of fights. What fantasy? Rage of Dragons has, like, a lot of fights. This has a lot more battles. Most of the action in this is, like, army versus army, and I think the army versus army is exceptionally done. So yeah, that's what I got. Dandelion Dynasty by Ken Liu. It just rules, and, like, on one hand, it would, if it was easy, like, if they were more similar, it'd be easier to recommend. But on the other hand, I feel like Ken told the story he wanted to, and I think it ended up being better for the people who it works for because of the variants. Also, warn you, Veiled Throne and Speaking Bones are one of the books that got split in two. Yes, these were the most split in two. They're each like 1,000 pages. Originally, it was one book. He failed at making it one book. Books just can't be that large. So Veiled Throne doesn't have much of a climax. I still really like Veiled Throne. For reference, Speaking Bones is my favorite. It's actually my ranking. There's very few series where my ranking of the books is clear. Speaking Bones is my favorite by a lot. Wall of Storms is second easily. Veiled Throne is clearly third, and Grace of Kings is clearly in fourth. That being said, I really like Grace of Kings. You can go see my Grace of Kings review. It's on the channel, and then you can go back and be like, wow, he liked all three clearly more, even the controversial Veiled Throne. Also, I have to mention it again, the review of Grace of Kings that gave it 1 star because it plagiarizes history is the worst review in the history of Goodreads, and if you wrote that review and are watching this, you should be ashamed of yourself for writing it. Like, have you ever heard of historical fiction? Anyway, that's completely separate. So basically, book 1, a lot of the plot is based on a historical event, and then that's not true for books 2, 3, and 4. Also, something else worth addressing, I've seen some people criticize the female characters in book 1, as in the abundance of them. I actually, after book 1, was like, that's a bit weird. Like, there's some really good ones here. But I will just note that I think this series has some of the best female characters, like, I've ever read. And the character who is my favorite in the series, by a lot, is one of the women characters, who's in book 1. So, there you go. There's a lot of characters in book 1. You can try and guess who it is. Yeah. Actually, representation-wise, which I've been more talking about quality. If you want some kind of representation, it's probably in here. I think it would be... I really want to see some more Song of Ice and Fire fans read this. It's obviously different than A Song of Ice and Fire. Most of the time, when people say, if you like this series, read this other series, I'm always kind of like, ugh. Like, it kind of depends what you like about the first series. And I think, there's... most series aren't as similar as we act like they are. That being said... I think a lot of A Song of Ice and Fire fans would really enjoy the Dandelion Dynasty. It also, along with a lot of my favorite series, like, it's extremely brutal. It does not pull punches at all. At times I've seen people be like, this is verging on grimdark, but it is also ultimately somewhat hopeful. Like, it's not nihilistic, which most of my favorite series are that. So if you regularly follow the channel, you know that this is another list of does not pull punches, but is ultimately hopeful in my top series list. It's most of my top series lists. But anyway, I hope you give them a try, unless, you know, it sounds like they're not your thing, in which case don't give them a try, because they're really long. And especially, I think, if you've read Grace of Kings, and, like, this is one of the series where I'd really encourage people to try Wall of Storms if they didn't like Grace of Kings. Especially if you just didn't like the style. Like, if you didn't like how zoomed out it is. Because you don't even have to read a lot of Wall of Storms. Like, it's a different style instantly. You can read, like, 100 pages of Wall of Storms. And then if you don't care, you can go, and I'll leave you alone. And one final note. Do not read the back covers of these books. Ever. Okay, when you're done the book, you can read the back cover of the book you just read. Wall of Storms is the worst back cover in the history of books. Do not read it. If you have not read Wall of Storms, Wall of Storms has a little heel turn, and it spoils it. Like, don't read it. Don't do it. Stop it. Okay. That's all I got. I hope you enjoyed my review of the Dandelion Dynasty by Ken Liu. Have a nice day, everyone. Why is my light doing that? Anyway, editing Jake here. You might be like, hey Jake, you haven't uploaded a video for a while. What's the reason? I don't have a good one. I was just being lazy and procrastinating. And also, for those of you who are really on the ball, you might be like, hey, wait a second. Usually your series review for series you really like. Why is my lamp? Gotta replace this lamp. Anyway, this light, because it's flickering and making noise. Flicker. Real time reference. Anyway, usually videos like these have dramatic intros. Yes, but I made this one, and I made a slightly different one. It's a reading from a story within a story from Speaking Bones, and I read the entire thing, and it was like 6.5 minutes long. So, it's at the end of the video. So, for those of you who want to hear about the courage of brutes, the ambition of nobles, and the grace of kings, here you go. Let a man fall with each 10 steps you take. Walk 1,000 miles, a new path to make. The Crown Prince of Matashi was a martial artist enthusiast and craved skilled sword fighters in his service. Gathering thousands of sword fighters in his castle, he asked them to dance and duel for his entertainment. Dozens were maimed or killed in bouts each day, while he lavished gold and jewels on the victors. The people whispered that the Crown Prince intended to start a war against the other Tira states as soon as he ascended to the throne. Ushin Padaji went to the Crown Prince's castle, demanding an audience. "Why have you come to see me?" asked the prince, taken aback because the itinerant scholar did not bow to him. "I heard that you like to meet heroes," said Padaji. "Are you a good swordsman, then?" The prince was skeptical. The man in front of him wasn't very tall, and his shoulders weren't very broad. He didn't look like a powerful sword fighter at all. "A man falls with each 10 steps I take, and I've walked 1,000 miles without anyone being able to stop me. I haven't bowed to you because my sword is too thirsty for blood. I fear, as I bend my waist, it will fall out of its sheath and demand a life meal." Impressed, the prince immediately asked Padaji to dine with him. As they feasted on platters of sliced fish and quaffed flagons of rice beer, the prince asked Padaji to describe his fighting skills in more detail. "I have 3 swords," said Padaji. "The courage of brutes, the ambition of nobles, and the grace of kings." "Tell me about the courage of brutes," said the prince, his eyes wide with excitement. "This is a sword forged from bronze, shaped by hammer and sharpened on stone. To wield it, one needs bulging muscles and a lust for blood. You can use it to lop off an opponent's head and spill his entrails on the ground. Fighting with it makes one no better than a beast bearing teeth and brandishing claws. In its wake are dozens of bodies and wasted potential." The prince's expression turned somber. "Tell me about the ambition of nobles." "This is a sword forged from determination, shaped by cunning, and sharpened on pride. To wield it, one needs the support of able strategists and the humility to listen to them. You can use it to conquer vast territories and humble your rivals. Fighting with it makes you one of the colossi striding across the land in every age. In its wake are widows and orphans, cries of lamentation, and cycles of vengeance." The prince's mien grew even darker. Tell me about the grace of kings." "This is a sword forged from hope, shaped by experience, and sharpened on wisdom. To wield it, one must have a heart that can emphasize with the meanest peasant, as well as the proudest prince. To bear compassion for the loyal friend, as well as the overweening foe. But one must also climb high and walk far enough to see beyond the here and now, to not be blinded by mere sentiment, to not mistake convention for truth. You can use it to defeat your enemies without fighting at all, and to realize the golden visions of ancient sages. The prince's eyes lit up. It is a very hard sword to learn to wield. Very. Alone among the world's blades, it has no hilt, no grip, no handle. To grasp it, the wielder will bleed first. To unleash its power, you may be required to harm those you love and to compromise with those you hate. You may be obliged to kneel before the conqueror and to sacrifice the innocent for a greater good. When you hold the grace of kings, a man will fall with every step you take, yet you may be compelled to march 1,000 miles without stopping to mourn. The prince shuddered. Then does fighting, with it leave you a name, praised and honored down the ages? In its wake, are there celebrations, dances, songs, and poems, admiring children and devoted elders? No, said Pajaji, shaking his head resolutely. No, the prince was confused. No, affirmed Pajaji. How can you foretell the shadow you'll cast upon the future when the future is a new river carving its own channel, even as it flows? While the grace of kings will reshape the world, what it leaves in its wake cannot be predicted. If you fight with the grace of kings, you may leave behind a golden age that will, in 10 generations' time, swell into a tide of sorrow to overwhelm the world, or a wasteland of devastation upon which 10 springs after the winter, a fresh, vibrant garden will sprout. If you wield it, be prepared to be remembered as a tyrant or a sage, a despot or a lawgiver, and perhaps all at once. But why is this? Because we are mortal and imperfect, because no wielder can stand high enough to take in all the suffering of the world, or to see far enough ahead to predict the flow of years beyond the horizon, because doubt is the only constant of our brief sojourn between the veil of incarnation and the river on which nothing floats. To act, even with the best of intentions, may lead to an evil greater than which was to be perceived. But to hesitate, even with the purest of designs, may lead to a proliferation of horrors worse than at first imagined. What is virtue today may one day be seen as vice. What is right today may one day be seen as wrong. It is folly to judge the rightness of an action solely by its consequences. For consequences beget consequences, and none of us can see to the end of all time or tally up the account of all souls. I thought you had come to persuade me that my enthusiasm for martial glory is misplaced, that I should not lean upon the courage of brutes or the ambition of nobles, said the prince. But the grace of kings doesn't sound much better. I'd rather not wield it at all. The grace of kings has far more power than any other sword, for both good and ill, said Padashi. My master, Ra-Oji, used to say that perhaps it would be best if the grace of kings could be cast into the ocean and allowed to sink out of sight, never to be recovered by mortal hands at all. I'm beginning to think Ra-Oji was right, muttered the prince. But we do not live in the world of parables and fables, said Padashi, his voice firm but kind. So long as the courage of brutes and the ambition of nobles exist, the grace of kings will always be forged, and it will be wielded by the deserving and the undeserving alike. I don't know what to do, cried the prince plaintively. Accept the necessity of doubt, said Padaji, but know also that you must end it before it ends you. He bowed. The sheath at his belt, it turned out, was empty, and departed. Afterward, the prince dismissed all the swordsmen in his employ and drove them from his castle.